Now we're going to look at 13 things I wish I could tell others about my grief. I didn't come up with this list, but I do think it's really good stuff, and I think it would be helpful. And again, I appreciate your thoughts and comments, and we want to try to be out by 8 o'clock. Number one, I wish you would not be afraid to speak my loved one's name. They lived and were important. I need to hear their name. What is in a name? What's in a name? It's who that person is. What? Yeah, the thought of it. It may have been a situation that caused them to have the name. You know, I've known of people who've been named Memphis because that's where they were born, or whatever the case may be. A lot of times people are afraid that after the death of loved ones, that it will bring tears or sadness to people if you mention them by name, their loved ones. More often than not, they would love to hear your name. They would love to hear that name because they may have not heard that name in a long time. I remember on occasions in a sermon giving an illustration of someone who had died, and after the funeral, after the church service, they came up and said, "Thank you so much for mentioning Josie. It's been 3 years and I think about her every day, and thank you for lifting her up that way." So it's really important that we keep that in mind. If it hurts them because of the mention of a name, they'll let you know. A lady in eastern Alabama was at home with her husband when he suddenly died of a heart attack. He had not died, but he had the heart attack. She called 911. They came and worked with him, but couldn't bring him back. As she tells the story, the coroner came and then the funeral home, and after the coroner was finished and her husband was placed on the cart, one of the guys from the funeral home said to the wife, the lady telling me the story, "We're getting ready to take the body away now." And she shouted, "His name is Herman." And she said, it hadn't been an hour, and they were already referring to him as a body, not as a person. It's important for us to keep that in mind. Number two, when I cry or get emotional when we talk about my loved one, I wish you knew it's not because you hurt me. The fact that my loved one died has caused my tears. You've allowed me to cry, and I thank you. Crying in emotional outbursts or normal. Can a person grieve and not cry? Yes. I went to see a doctor this past week, and the nurse was giving information to me and whatever, and she asked why I was there, and I told her, and we'd moved here and started talking about this workshop. And she said, "My husband died, and I did not cry for 5 years." And I said, "Really?" She said, "Yeah, and I moved from Houston, Texas to this little place here in Tennessee, and I was thinking about everybody else and not me and not my grief. And it took me 5 years to process it. And whenever I finally began to grieve, I cried solidly for 2 days. I told my son, I'm okay, I just cried." She had a lot of making up to do. Some people don't have tear ducts. They can't cry like they would like to. Lady in Athens, Alabama, who had 8 losses over 22 months, said, "I couldn't shed a tear." We then talked about it from a biblical point of view in that class. And the next week she said, "For the first time in 22 months, I cried. Thank you for what you said." That was the Bible talking. Shortest verse in the Bible, right? Jesus wept. And so we need to keep that in mind in regards to the tears that people have. Number 3, I wish you would not kill my loved one again by removing from your home remembrances, pictures. They are still a part of our lives. Some people may think the idea is that It brings too much sadness to have that picture of that loved one. But in most cases, it's going to bring out remembrances. I tell people at the holidays, especially if it's the first holidays, put out pictures of that loved one that has died in the last year. Put them on the coffee table, and as folks come around at Thanksgiving or at Christmas, they'll see that picture and say, you know, I was there in the boat with George whenever we went fishing. That picture shows it. And what you don't know is he almost lost his rod whenever that fish jerked on that. And he finally brought it in. It was a big one. But we laughed crazily because he almost lost it the first time. Then they begin to do what you wanted them to do. Not talk about how he died, but how he lived. And so those pictures, those remembrances mean a great deal. I brought this. This is the first time I've shared this. But my mother, who died 2.5 years before my dad, when she was in the realm of dementia, wrote this note to my dad. Joe, I love and appreciate all you do for the Lord's work and His people. May He keep you and bless you. I love you so very much, Dot. And then she wrote over in the side, take care of my Joe. I wouldn't take $1,000 for that note. Although they're dead and gone, it helps me to see it every day, to know that they are alive and that they want me to keep on living so that we can be with them. Notes, letters, pictures, those are so important, things that they made. Number 4, I'll have emotional ups and downs, highs and lows. I wish you wouldn't think that if I have a good day, my grief is all over, and if I have a bad day, I need psychiatric counseling. In grief, there are 6 words that's very important to remember. Those 6 words include 3 different processes of your grief journey. First of all, get by. Get by. You may be just getting by in your grief journey tonight. What does getting by mean? Getting up out of bed. Just trying to survive. Secondly, and there's a big distance between the first one and the second one, get better. Get better. Well, how do you do that? Well, maybe come to a grief support class. Maybe read books. Maybe go to a counselor. Get better. The third one, get beyond. Notice I did not say get over. You're not going to get over. But you seek to get by, you seek in time to get better, and you seek in time to get beyond. Get beyond does not mean that you forget your loved one. It does not mean that you're over that. No, that person is still a part of you. There is an imprint on your heart and your life, and it will always be there as long as you draw breath, because of who they are and because of whose they are. But that's what we try to do, and it takes time to do that. Number 5, being a bereaved person is not contagious, so I wish you would not shy away from me. C.S. Lewis was a religious theologian. At one time, he did not believe in God's existence, and he studied his way to that existence of understanding. But in the book Shadowlands, there's a movie that was made about this, in which C.S. Lewis from England or wherever meets an American widow, falls in love with her, eventually marries her, and then 2 years into that wonderful marriage, for the very first time for him, she has cancer and ultimately dies. And now he's looking at life as a widower. And in that book, he made a statement. Maybe grieving people ought to be placed like lepers in a leper colony. Because he said, I can't talk about my grief to men. They just don't want to talk about it. They want to talk about something else. And he felt ostracized. A lady told me on one occasion about the loss of a child, and after the funeral, former friends wouldn't allow their children to come to her home and play with the other children because of that loss. How painful is that? There was nothing concerning the death of that child would prevent anybody from coming to visit and be with their own children, other children. If anything, those other children needed friends around them, right? And yet, that was sort of the idea going along with it. We did a workshop in Delaware, and an elder said one time when he was dealing with a grief loss, somebody said, "Your grief suffocates me." He couldn't understand why they would think that or why they would say that, because he was just trying to deal with the loss that he was dealing with. Need to make sure they're not contagious. Romans 12:15 still says, "Rejoice with them that do rejoice, and," not or, "and weep with them that weep." As children of God, we have an obligation from God the Father to be there in joyous times when people in our congregation have wonderful events, but also to be there when they're in the valley. And not just for a couple of weeks, but for the distance. And so it's really important to do that. Romans 12:15 tells us that. Number 6, I wish you knew that the crazy grief reactions I'm having are in fact very normal. Depression, anger, frustration, etc. are to be expected following the death of a loved one. What's the number one question that typically we ask grieving people? 4 words. How are you doing? What's the number one answer that typically grieving people give us? There's 2 words. I'm fine. Why do grieving people often say they're fine when they're not? I took it from what you were saying because that's what they expect you to say? Yeah, that's right. Why else? Why else would they say, I'm fine, when they're not really? They don't want to talk about it. And that's certainly a prerogative. They're right. Or they're thinking that if they say I'm fine, then they'll leave them alone. Or that's what they want them to say, and they can check that off their list. A lady in our class had lost a husband who was a Christian and an engineer with a major corporation in Chattanooga. Was riding his motorcycle back to work from Florence and had a motorcycle accident and died. She was in my grief class, 10-week class. And during that 10-week class, she told this story that on a Wednesday night in Florence Boulevard Church of Christ in Florence, Alabama, where I attended after I stopped preaching full time. There was a deacon there. A man came to her out of the foyer on a Wednesday night after services and said, maybe 3 months removed after the death of the husband, "How are you doing?" And she said, "I lost it. I just screamed in his face and ran out the door and cried my eyes out. But as I ran, I thought to myself, he really wants to know. It's not just something to be said." Because he said, "How are you doing?" And so she said, I got my face back together, got myself back together, and went in and told him just how hard it had been. And how hard it had been on our kids, losing their daddy that way, not being able to say goodbye. But she said, I really appreciated that he really wanted to know. And folks out there in the foyer or down front or in a classroom, when you ask the question, make sure you give them the space and the opportunity to answer it if they want to. And if not, at least they know that you do care. And that's so very important. We just need to know that people are going to be there with us on the journey. I had a thought this past week that I had not thought of before. But in John chapter 19, when Jesus looked down from the cross and saw John, the one whom he loved, standing there, remember what he said? He looked at his mother and said, "Woman, behold your son. Son, behold your mother." And the Bible says, and he took her home. And I thought to myself, John was already there, but maybe the part of this, and I never had thought of this before, back home were brothers and sisters, right? And they were grieving the loss of their brother, even though he was Jesus, the Son of God, also the Son of Man. Maybe he thought they're going to need somebody who's not related to help with this great grief process. And so who better than the one that loved me so much to go and love them? Again, I'm not saying that that's the way it is, but maybe that was the situation. We know that's the way it worked. He took her to his own home. I've often thought, well, where are the brothers and sisters? They were grieving. Maybe the Lord, in his last moment, said they're going to need John to help them through their grief. Different perspective, I don't know. But it's an interesting thought. Any thoughts or comments before we continue on? Number 7, I wish you would not expect my grief to be over in 6 months. The first few years are going to be exceedingly traumatic for me. As with an alcoholic, I will never be cured or a former bereaved person, but forever a recovered, bereaved person. Henry Nouwen came up with the concept that grieving people are wounded healers. I like that concept. Think about it. You're hurting, but you're also, through your grief journey, healing. Another person came up with creative survivors. Creative survivors. They're holding on to all they can, and they're looking for ways to create to try to make that work, to get better. Grief is visible and invisible. It's mourning and an expression, but it's also hidden in the depths of the mind and the soul. You know, they say an iceberg, 60 to 70% of it is under the surface. You just see the top part, but there's a whole lot more underneath. In our grief, there may be a whole lot more that people don't see that we have to deal with. Number 8, I wish you understood the physical reactions to grief. I may gain weight or lose weight, sleep all the time or not at all, develop a host of illnesses, and be accident prone, all of which may be related to my grief. I knew a lady who worked 72 hours straight after a funeral. She could not quit. She just had to clean. That was her way. And when she crashed, as she tells the story, I crashed for days. Now, some people would say, well, she's over it. No, she wasn't over it. She just put it aside. And that was the way she dealt with it. To work literally 72 hours straight without going to sleep over the death of a mom. Everybody's different. Number 8, I wish you understood. Okay, we mentioned that. Grief can affect us in so many ways, but studies have shown that it literally affects the immune system. Widowers are more prone to illness in the first year following the death of their wife. Widows are more prone to illness in the second to third year following the death of their mate. I've had people who tell me, before the loss of my loved one, I didn't do this, but now I sigh a lot. There's the loss of energy. Some of it mentioned choking, feeling a choking sensation. Again, just all the emotions that are coming out. I did a grief dementia workshop in Clinton, Tennessee, and there was a lady who had lost a son very suddenly in a car accident. And she had also lost her husband. And she said, in a Knoxville, Tennessee support group that I am a part of, what you said about affecting physical illness because of grief is true. She said more of those widows had physical surgeries in the third to fourth year following the death of their loved one. And she herself was dealing with cancer. So she said there's validity to this idea that it does affect us physically. Number 9, my loved one's birthday, the anniversary of their death, and holidays are terrible times for me. I wish you would tell me that you are thinking about my loved one on those days, and if I get quiet and withdrawn, just know that I'm thinking about them too, so don't try to coerce me into being cheerful. Grieving people are not going to forget their loved ones. But you know what? They're afraid we will. When I was a full-time minister and we had someone in our church to lose a loved one, I would write it down on a calendar. A year from that date, close to it, I'd write them a letter, letting them know that I knew this was the week of the first year of the death of their whoever, and that I was praying with them and for them. I did that for the first 3 years following that time because I didn't want them to think that they had been forgotten. And that was something that people really seemed to forget, really seemed to appreciate. One lady told about how that following the death, I think, of a child, she got an anonymous note from somebody in her church every day, 365 of them for a year, and how that those notes meant so much to her in her grief journey. Number 10, it's normal that most of us examine our faith, values, and beliefs after losing loved ones. Death causes us to ask questions and search for answers. I wish you would pray for me and walk with me in my journey. It's important to know that there are people who are with us, not only on the mountaintops, but also in the valleys. And that they're going to be with us in our grief journey. And that's going to help us a great deal. Number 11, I wish you would not offer me anything to ease the pain. These are temporary crutches. The only way I can get through my grief is to experience it. Prescription medication may be necessary, but I will hurt before I heal. The Indians have a statement, I will not judge a man till I've walked 2 miles in his moccasins. We sometimes may look at a situation and say, well, if I were them, but you're not them. You're not, and that person that died wasn't yours. And so we need to be real careful about judging and saying what I would do. Oh yeah, we certainly don't need to hurt ourselves or do something that's wrong or contrary to Scripture. I'm not talking about those things. But we don't need to judge others till we walked with them. And I've had people ask me, well, what about so-and-so taking this medication? I said, look, I'm not a doctor. That doctor knows that patient. I don't. That's entirely his decision and their decision. They may need that for various reasons. Why should I judge otherwise when I'm not them or I don't know anything about them? Number 12, I wish you understood that people change. Grief changes people. I'm not the same person I was before my loved one died, and I'll never be that person again. If you keep waiting for me to get back to my old self, you'll be frustrated. I am a new creature with new thoughts, dreams, and aspirations. Please try to get to know the new me. Maybe you'll still like me. In Georgia, there was a lady who told me she was a preacher's wife, a minister's wife. Many years ago, her husband died with a sudden heart attack between Sunday school and worship, right there in the building. After the funeral, for days and weeks and maybe even a few months, people kept on coming to her as the preacher's wife. And she said, I was no longer the minister's wife because they were going to have to bring in a minister, rightly so, because my husband died. And yet they weren't seeing me as a grieving widow, as a grieving spouse. They kept on seeing me as the minister's wife. And they weren't ministering to me. And even though I was asking for help, they just kept on saying all the things that you might say, but they weren't helpful. And she told my brother and I finally, after a year or two, had to move to another congregation so that they could see me as a grieving widow, not as the preacher's wife. Thought that was somewhat interesting. Number 13, stay the course with me. I need you now and later as well. I don't need you to feel like you have to fix this. Somebody mentioned that during the break. I just need you to listen. I wish you would not see me as an assignment and then check out after some visits. We're going to look at the story of Job and those three friends, Bildad, Zophar, and the other one. What's the other one? Bildad, Zophar, and Eliphaz. There you go. When they saw Job and all his pain, did they decide to leave? No. The Bible says in Job chapter 2, verses 11 through 13, they became like him. They tore their garments. They put dust on their head. And then they sat down with him for how long? 7 days. The point was, they couldn't take away his pain. Whatever they could say would not help that great deal, but they could be there with him. And literally, it was only when they opened their mouths that problems began, when they began to finally accuse him of things that weren't true. There's something to be said for that. Here's a fact. 97% of friends stop visiting the bereaved 2 weeks after the funeral. Many of you can agree with that because you've been there. 97% of friends, not family, but friends, stop visiting the bereaved 2 weeks after the funeral. In some cases, the shock and numbness is just wearing off, and they need us more than ever not be there. And so that's very, very important. In closing, let me give you 10 things that really aren't helpful to say, okay? This is a list that people have through the years given me of things that really were not helpful to them. Number 1, you have so much to be thankful for. There's one way of saying, well, that's true, but when you're dealing with a loss, especially one unexpected, especially whatever, those words just aren't going to be very helpful to them then. Number 2, everything's going to be okay. Well, that's a generic statement, but again, right now it doesn't feel that way because of this loss. Number 3, you are so strong. I've had too many ladies say, boy, one lady said, I just wanted to sock them. She was a preacher's wife. I said, I sure am glad you didn't do that. I said, wouldn't that be terrible? Just read. in the paper. Former bereaved former preacher's wife lays out somebody in the church pews. No, I said, but she said those words aren't helpful. You're so strong. Number 4, you look so good. Again, when you've cried all your makeup off, or you're just standing there and you're so close to whatever, those words are not helpful. Number 5, from a theological point of view, I know this is true, but from somebody bereaved, he or she is in a better place. We certainly know the Bible says that a faithful child of God or a little child dies, that they're in a better place, that the child is safe. The other, according to God's word, is saved if they've lived that Christian life and go to paradise and such like. But sometimes there's a time for that, but it may not be right there at the beginning. Number 6, part of God's plan. This was part of God's plan. Are you saying it was part of God's plan for those 60 plus people to be killed in that plane crash? I don't think we would say that was the plan of God this past week. Terrible accidents take place, whatever the case was concerning the helicopter and the plane, but to say that was the will of God, I just don't think anybody would suggest that. Number 7, it will get better in time. Yes, what you do with your time, that might or might not be helpful. Number 8, everything happens for a reason. Again, back to the plane crash. Was there a reason for that, or was it just error or whatever? Number 9, don't ask me how they died. There's questions. People who need to know will find that out. But that's private information. I don't ask that question. I just say, I'm sorry when I've heard that. Unless, now if I'm doing a funeral, then that might be helpful for me to know something, but I'm going to ask that somebody else, funeral director, or whatever the case may be. But that's private information that's really not helpful to some people. And then number 10, and this is one that we often say so many times, if you need me, call me. What's wrong with that statement? They shouldn't have to. You're going to be calling me already. And then secondly, you've put the burden of them remembering you on themselves. You need me, call me. Well, now, on top of all her grief and on top of all the family and top of all the other things, she's got to remember who I am and my phone number if she really needs my help. That's just putting too much on them. Instead, sister, I am so sorry for your loss. If it's okay with you, 3 days after the funeral, I want to come to your house and I'd like to do this or this or this or take you wherever you need to go. Would that be okay? I've put the burden on me, not on her. She doesn't need that. And so we give the opportunity, or we just say, one of the things you can do, eventually you have to take the papers to all the different places. Sister, I'd like to be your taxi that day. When all the death notifications come in, I'm going to call you, and if you will be willing for me to, I'll drive you up to the courthouse. I'll drive you to the funeral home. I'll drive you to... I'll be your taxi. All you have to do is get out. I'll stay with you. Which one makes more sense? Putting it all on her, or you take that's just one thing we can do. Simple, but how profound it is to help people. And that's really, really important. Well, there's other things on that list could be going, but those are the 10, and it's 1 minute till 8 o'clock, and I wanted us to get out here before then. And Roy, I'm going to turn it over to you.